Listen, all you're doing is telling your Christian audience what you want them to know while you don't tell them the things that you don't want them to know. That's not particularly allowing them to make a judgment based on all the information. You're holding some of it back. Detective J. Warner Wallace, the founder of Cold Case Christianity, routinely makes videos stating that the apostles of Jesus of Nazareth had nothing to gain by preaching the gospel and making claims of his resurrection from the dead. Detective Wallace also gives considerable space to these same nothing to gain arguments in his book Cold Case Christianity, dedicating chapter 14 to the topic. Detective Wallace is simply wrong. The New Testament provides evidence that the apostles themselves benefited from the crucifixion of Jesus, and they benefited again by circulating stories of his resurrection from the dead. That is the topic for today's briefing training. Prior to meeting Jesus, the New Testament depicts the apostles as Galilean fishermen. They unexpectedly meet Jesus and with almost no hesitation at all, leave their fishing businesses behind and join Jesus' ministry around the Sea of Galilee. While serving with Jesus, the apostles live as poor, itinerant evangelists. Jesus has no interest in money. He has no interest in tomorrow. Jesus' main concern is preaching the arrival of God's kingdom, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and evangelizing repentance, forgiveness, and salvation. There's plenty of evidence in the New Testament that Jesus was eccentric. Not totally crazy or gravely disabled, nothing like that. Just eccentric. Somebody who's a bit odd, who might not always read their environment properly. Somebody overly passionate about possibilities and not concerned enough about actual reality. Eccentric people can be and often are some of the most charismatic and talented of all human beings. They also tend to push the envelope of acceptability a little too far, and they make enemies. Jesus and his apostles leave remote Galilee and they head south to populated Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Jesus pushes things too far. He's declared an enemy of the Roman state and he is fatally crucified. What happens to the apostles after Jesus is crucified? After he is out of the way? Let's take a look at the evidence. One of the problems with the New Testament is I'm constantly having to make disclaimers. I am not suggesting that the stories in the New Testament are historically accurate. It is my view that these stories are filled with fiction and outrageous legendary enhancements. The authors were biased. They were trying to make Jesus into a divine Messiah, but because of their unsophisticated writings, they actually depict Jesus as a mistaken doomsayer. Even though the evidence, in my view, is overwhelmingly poor, it is the evidence that we actually have. If we want to try and figure out what possibly could have happened over 2,000 years ago, we are forced to use the New Testament as evidence. Detective Wallace says this is good evidence. So let's take a quick listen to what Detective Wallace has to say.
Rather than 5 slightly different stories. And that's what you want, because the puzzle pieces have different shaped edges. My job is to put the pieces together. And that only when the pieces are put together will you get the entire picture. So I'm not looking for you to make every piece the same. I need to know what you saw, and there'll be some differences. By the way, the defense teams are always going to exploit these differences. I'm over it. That's what's going to happen. But the reality of it is we'll be able to show the jury that these are just puzzle pieces that fit together, and they actually make sense of each other. It just means that they're coming at it from different perspectives. My job is to figure out what the perspectives are.
All right, let's go ahead and do that. Let's look at different witness perspectives. The New Testament contains several stories where the apostles are arguing with one another as who will become the greatest. These scenes depict the apostles as being interested in power and prestige. In Detective Wallace's book, he highlights the pursuit of power as one of the motivational factors for people to commit crimes, to exaggerate, and to lie. The exact things that the apostles are arguing about. In one such caper, John and James get their mother involved, and they 3 go to Jesus and kneel at his feet. John and James's mother asks Jesus to put one of her sons on Jesus's right and the other on Jesus's left in God's kingdom. The other 10 apostles hear about what happened and they become indignant with John and James. To Jesus' credit, he is not impressed by any of this. He sits everyone down and rebukes them and teaches them about what is required for leadership: humble servitude. The apostles never seem to understand Jesus' teaching on humble servitude. They are so focused on the pursuit of power, they literally argue about it at the Last Supper. Who will become the greatest? Just before Jesus is arrested, tried, and killed, they're still thinking about the pursuit of power. Let's take a look at the lives of the apostles both before Jesus' crucifixion and then after Jesus' crucifixion. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, there's a story about Jesus finishing a sermon late in the afternoon. The apostles start complaining about the time of day and they want the people that are there sent away. Send hungry people away without feeding them? That's not how Jesus operates. Jesus rebukes his apostles and immediately starts ordering them around as if they're feudal serfs. Let's take a look at the individual passages. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 through 16. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Let's look at a perspective from John's Gospel about the exact same story. John chapter 6, verse 12. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. Both Matthew and John's Gospel depict Jesus as ordering his apostles to feed the people and then clean up after them. Let's look at another perspective of the same story from Mark's Gospel this time. Mark chapter 6, verses 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Mark's Gospel depicts Jesus as ordering his apostles to get in the boat and get ready for their next mission after they've completed this mission. Jesus is clearly the boss in these particular passages, and he's ordering his apostles around like they're hired help. Let's fast forward to a time after Jesus' crucifixion. Luke's book of Acts starts with a story called Choosing of the Seven. The situation is some of the widows in the early church are being neglected in the daily ration of food. So how are the apostles, the church officials, going to deal with this problem of hungry widows? Acts chapter 6, verses 2 through 4. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word. The apostles went from serving hungry people under Jesus to getting other people to serve hungry widows under Peter. A small piece of evidence that the apostles went from lowly servants to more important church administrators. An increase in power. Power, the very thing that Detective Wallace says is a motivator for people to lie.
On the stand, it turns out bias comes down to one of 3 motives, and only 3 motives. I've talked about it on this show in the past. There are only 3 reasons why anyone commits a murder. And I've learned these over the years. Only 3 reasons why anyone steals something, lies about something, commits any crime. It is simply this: financial greed, sexual or relational lust, or the pursuit of power. Now,
in the 5th chapter of Acts, we have the infamous caper of Ananias and Sapphira. This story deserves far more attention than it actually receives. What's going on is a Christian community in the early church raises funds by selling off portions of their land and then taking the profits from those land sales and laying those profits at the feet of Peter and John. Think about that for a second. Laying their money at Peter and John's feet. The money is then later redistributed to anybody that has a need. This seemingly successful socialistic society turns dark. Ananias and his wife Sapphira sell off a portion of their land, and they take part of the profit and lay only part of the profit at Peter and John's feet, while they retain some of the money for themselves. Peter seems to be miraculously aware of this particular conspiracy, and he rebukes Ananias, telling him, "You have Satan in your heart and you are lying to God." Instead of just telling Ananias, "Look it, you could have simply given me the level of funding to which you were comfortable." After Peter's rebuke, Ananias drops dead, and a great fear comes over the church. Later, some shadowy men come in, they take Ananias' corpse, and they bury it.
What made you think of doing such a thing? This is absurd. You've lied. Not just to us, but to God. Bury him. Now.
3 hours later, the story turns darker still. Sapphira shows up and is interrogated by Peter. During Sapphira's interrogation, she only speaks 5 words. "Yes, that is the price," seemingly an admission that she did hold some of the land sale profit back for herself. Peter then mocks Sapphira, and he tells her the feet of the men who buried your husband are right outside, and they're going to bury you too. Sapphira then drops dead, and the same shadowy men that buried her husband come in, collect her corpse, and bury her as well. A great fear comes over the whole church.
Where's Ananias?
Listen. Feet of the man who buried your husband are just outside. They mean to bury you too.
What is the symbolism of power being displayed with this story? A wealthy community coming in and stooping down and laying their money at the feet of Peter and John. The deaths of Ananias and Sapphira occur after Jesus' extremely brutal execution for the payment of man's original sin. What was the purpose of Jesus' sacrifice at all? Jesus taught a message of repentance, forgiveness, and salvation. The new sheriff in town, Peter, he mocks the condemned. He creates a great fear in his own church, and he participates in public death. Peter is a gangster. Do the apostles get to keep some of the money? Interestingly enough, another witness answers this question for us. Paul. In his first letter to the Corinthian church in chapter 9, Paul is doing a lot of complaining about the conduct of the apostles and prattling on about his own perceived greatness. Paul writes that he is willing to laboriously work to support his needs without taking any money from the church to spread the gospel. On the other hand, Paul writes that the apostles are supporting themselves and their wives from church funds, and he specifically writes they do not work for a living. Paul is providing some evidence that the apostles are dependent on church tithing. Growing the church would increase the number of people that are tithing, which increases the financial capabilities of the church, which is used to support the apostles and their wives, making them dependent on church tithing. That is a reason to fudge the facts a little bit, a reason to exaggerate, a reason to lie. Financial dependence. Let's take a look at the verses, what I'm talking about. But don't take my word for it. You need to investigate this stuff for yourself. I'm just telling you where to look. You should be looking into it yourself, reading 1 Corinthians and making your own decisions, not just believing me. Let's take a look at the verses. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas, Peter? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Paul is introducing the idea in verse 4 that the apostles get their food and drink from the church. And then in verse 6, he somewhat solidifies that by saying that he's working for a living, but the apostles are not working for a living. Let's take a look at some more important verses in the same chapter. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? If we have sown spiritual seeds among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded for those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel.
Already thinking this way. The first is simple: financial gain. People do a lot of crazy things for money. A lot of stupid occurs because of the pursuit of money. The second one you might also kind of get easily, and that is either sexual or relational lust. Those kinds of motivations also will drive people to do things they shouldn't do. So we've got so far money and sex. The third thing is a little more nuanced. It is the pursuit of power. Of respect, authority, position, influence. These are things that are in the power category that motivate people to do things they shouldn't do. When someone's lying to me, I always know that their bias or their motivation lies in one of those three areas. It makes it very easy to assess a lie.
The New Testament is such poor evidence, I have yet again to make another disclaimer. I don't find this braggadocious self-promoter Paul to be a credible source of information. Paul is an extremist. Extremists tend to not be the most trustworthy people. One day Paul's an extremist in opposition to the gospel. The very next day he's an extremist in favor of the gospel. Sort of like the first century's version of Alex Jones. Paul could very well be exaggerating his claims that the apostles were not working and were living off church funds to make himself look more pious. I don't believe Paul. In chapter 14 of Cold Case Christianity, Detective Wallace is explaining the motivations for people to commit crimes: sex, money, and power. He goes on to explain how the apostles were not benefiting from any of these motivational factors and thus had no reason to lie. The whole system of American justice is based on truthful law enforcement investigations and honest, law-abiding police detectives. When we look at Detective Wallace's arguments in chapter 14, we find evidence that he is being downright dishonest. On page 243 of Cold Case Christianity, Detective Wallace is arguing that the apostles were not motivated by illicit sexual desires or relationships. He directly quotes 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, which reads, "Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas." Cephas is Peter. They're the same person. Detective Wallace is corroborating the likelihood that the apostles were accompanied by their wives. The inference is obvious. A man alongside his wife is less likely to be involved in illicit sex than a man who is by himself. But what is deeply disturbing about Detective Wallace's quote of 1 Corinthians 9:5 are the verses that he left out. They are literally the adjoining verses. Let's take a quick look. We have seen these verses already before in this video. In red is what Detective Wallace quoted in his book Cold Case Christianity. But as you can see, highlighted in black are the verses that he left out. Verse number 4, don't we have the right to food and drink? Paul is introducing the idea that the apostles are getting their food and drink from church funds. Verse number 6, or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right not to work for a living? Paul is introducing the idea that the apostles themselves are not working for a living. They are benefiting from church funds by getting their food and drink and not having to work. Detective Wallace's conduct in American courtrooms is called hiding the ball. When a police detective has information that tends to cast doubt on their case and they purposely don't report it. Detective Wallace, this has the appearance of overt dishonesty. You advertise yourself as an honorable and talented homicide detective. Several celebrity pastors wrote personal recommendations for your book, including Sean McDowell, Greg Kokel, and Paul Copen. Christian author Lee Strobel wrote one of the 2 forewords for your book. And yet I am claiming that you either knew or you should have known that there's information that you failed to report in your book to your Christian audience. This conduct demands a public explanation. What do you have to say for yourself? Although not directly related to Detective Wallace's quote, it's still the same letter. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, Paul is clearly asking for cold, hard cash. Cash to be collected in Corinth and sent 800 miles away to Jerusalem. A different letter, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul is making a very passionate pitch to the Corinthian church with the intent of increasing tithing. He admits to taking money from an impoverished church in Macedonia in his effort to increase tithing in Corinth. Taking impoverished people's money in Macedonia to send to Jerusalem, only to have a portion of it siphoned off by the apostles and their wives? Christianity is a money-making business. It always has been, it always will be. Okay, you skeptics and atheists are not going to like this part. As a senior soldier in the Salvation Army, it was my experience that the Corps officers in charge were honest people. They could have made far more money with their considerable talents in government jobs or in the private sector, yet they chose to serve in the Salvation Army. I've seen police chaplains who are volunteers, they're not paid at all, respond to the most tragic of circumstances. They handled them amazingly and were helpful. Yes, some celebrity pastors are charlatans for sure. But it's been my overwhelming experience that pastors tend to be honest, ethical, and caring people. Detective Wallace shields himself in the safe confines of Christian echo chambers. He does not do public debates. If Detective Wallace's ministry is analogous to a police officer's job, then Detective Wallace is not a street cop out confronting the criminal element or answering dangerous calls for service. Nope. He's a desk cop, only leaving the police station to attend fat cat lunches and hobnob with his Christian supporters. My challenges to Detective Wallace for public debate have so far gone totally unanswered. Thank you so much for your time and listening to my comments and my ideas. Take care and stay safe.